Hello, everyone. I'm Adelaide, the Manager of Leadership Development Programs here at Creative Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I live and work. And I pay my deep respects to the First Nations elders of this place, both past and present, and extend that to all First Nations folks who are watching this video today. I also want to acknowledge the lands and the elders of the lands from which you are joining us from today. The Governance Conversation series is a collaborative project between Creative Australia and Diversity Arts Australia, also known as DARTS. This series is designed to explore contemporary critical issues in arts governance, showcasing ideas, perspectives, and approaches that support artists and communities. We are grateful to DARTS for their insightful programming and bringing some really incredible guests from their extended network to this series. Our thanks to Gurkum Agarulu and Lena Nahlous and the team at DARTS, as well as our marketing and communications team here at Creative Australia for making this possible. You can check out the other conversations in this series on our website, creative.gov.au. You can also find recordings of past conversations on our website as well. This pre-recorded webinar will be the last session in the series, and I want to thank Lena, Gurkum and the DARTS team and all of our past guests again for these incredibly stimulating conversations. Governance can sometimes be a dry issue, a dry thing to talk about, but in these conversations we've really seen some exciting and critical issues enlivened through the conversations that we've had with the guests. We will soon be announcing another initiative as part of our governance program, which will be an online hub hosted on the Creative Australia website that will include the recordings of all of the governance conversations in this series, as well as some newly developed resources, including template policies and case studies to support good governance, along with a series of links and resources to other examples of governance best practice. You can follow Creative Australia on social media or via our newsletter to stay up to date with us and details for the launch of the Governance Hub. Now I'm going to pass over to Lena, who will be our host for the session today.
Thanks for that warm welcome, Adelaide, and to all of the team at Creative Australia for all of their support. Before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the First Peoples of the lands on which I am on today. For me, that's the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm a middle-aged Arab woman. I have light olive skin, dark brown wavy hair with some greys, and I'm currently wearing a navy blue shirt and black rimmed glasses. Thank you for joining us for this final governance conversation in the series. As Adelaide mentioned, I'm Lena Nahlous and I'm the CEO of Diversity Arts Australia, and we're very pleased to be partnering with Creative Australia and facilitating these conversations, and particularly today's really important conversation on regenerative practices and climate justice. And this is the 6th conversation and final in the series. For those who may not be aware of our work and may be wondering why we're so interested in facilitating these important conversations, Diversity Arts Australia is Australia's national voice for ethnocultural and migrant cultural and racial equity in the arts, screen and creative sectors. So our work includes research, advocacy, training, events and resources like the Creative Equity Toolkit, which, by the way, has an excellent topic area on governance that you should visit. We believe that all good diversity practices are strongly connected to good governance practices, and that it's absolutely essential that that justice, equity, diversity and inclusion are embedded into all good governance practices. And so that is some of our interest in these kinds of conversations. And they don't kind of stand alone from the other work that we do, and even directly impact our work if you think about the climate emergency and the impact on people from across the globe, and how that then impacts migration patterns and our own migrants and people from refugee backgrounds in Australia and future people, or us in the region. So now for some so I just wanted to introduce our wonderful speakers today. We're joined by two people with a very deep commitment to climate justice and regenerative environmental practices, who also bring very different approaches and perspectives on how and strategies that organisations and institutions can take in this area. In this conversation, they'll be inviting organisations and institutions to consider their values and their capacity to take action. So I want to welcome Pippa Bailey and Professor James Arvanitakis. So I'd also like to introduce, and I will come back to them in a minute. Sorry, at the very last minute, we've changed this session and turned it into a pre-record. So I'm kind of checking my notes as I'm going. I'd like to also thank our wonderful Auslan interpreters, Sean Sweeney and Rebecca Ladd, who are providing Auslan support, and to thank our captioners. So captions are also available for this video by clicking on the captions button. Today's session will run for around 90 minutes, and we'll explore the relationship between governance and climate justice. We'll investigate what it looks like to be both economically sustainable and environmentally regenerative. If we accept that climate change mitigation is an intrinsic part of governance responsibility, how do we then develop new ways of working and start to implement them? So I'd now like to introduce the first of our presenters today, Pippa Bailey. Pippa's CV is much longer than the one I'm about to read out, so this is the abbreviated version. Pippa Bailey is an independent producer, director and consultant who grew up and works on Wongal land in Sydney. She's committed to culture leading on climate action to create a fair and sustainable future. Pippa started her career as an actor and a reporter and producer with SBS TV. She held leading roles in the UK, including the Museum of on London's South Bank, O-Art at Oxford House in Bethnal Green, the world-famous company of pyrotechnicians, and Total Theatre Awards at Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Since 2013, Pippa has worked as a senior producer with several big organisations, significant organisations, Performing Lions, Sydney Festival, and in the First Nations team at Carriage Works. As director and producer for Change Fest from 2019 to 2021, she worked in collaboration with elders and communities to create events that imagine systems change and rehearse fairer futures. She's currently working with First Nations artists Henrietta Bard and Jacob Bohm, led by First Nations protocols. And Pippa co-convenes the Cultural Gardeners, Australian Cultural Alliance for Climate Justice, with Climb Art and Arts Front. Pippa is also a coordinator with Culture Declares Emergency UK, member of Collaborative Futures, and sits on the boards of Theatre Network New South Wales and IETM, the International Network for the Performing Arts. So over to you, Pippa. Pippa's going to talk for around 10 minutes, and then we'll pass to James.
Thanks so much, Lena. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. This is a big topic. Before I start, I also will acknowledge that I'm on Wongal land today, unceded Wongal land, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm a Caucasian woman with fair skin, dangly earrings, a pink and grey dress, and sort of curly red hair. This is a big topic, and as I start to talk about climate justice, I just want to give a bit of a trigger warning. There's no sweet coating this. It's really difficult territory. So just for the first few minutes, I'm going to give some big picture statistics and a bit of a sense of where we're up to in terms of climate change. And then we'll move on, and I promise that by the end of this session, I'll have some solutions and some positivity in terms of what arts organisations and governance can do in this space. But to start with, as I hope people are aware, the United Nations is one of the key international players in terms of gathering information from across the globe and having having an intergovernmental panel on climate change. They produce IPCC reports, and that's where we get regular updates in terms of where the world is at in the climate emergency. And so the latest one on climate change was delivered in 2023. And basically, these are the kind of areas that we need to be concerned about. So the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and they think it's unmatched for around 2 million years. So we're really in a state where we don't quite know what that's going to do, although of course science has a lot of very educated guesses. There's glacial retreat, so that's both at the polar ice caps and also on the top of big mountains. And the last decade has been warmer than any other period of recorded history. And the scientists think that's for more than 125,000 years. We've got sea level rise, that's faster than any other period in history. The summer Arctic ice coverage is shrinking. The oceans are warming, and also there's ocean acidification. So they're the kind of key indicators that tell us that the climate is changing really quickly. And one of the major contributors to this climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. So that's coal, oil, and gas. And that accounts for somewhere between 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. In terms of a sort of big picture of the contributors to climate change, they say that industry is around 30%. This is global, so it's generalized. About 30% of commercial and residential activity, 11% of agriculture, and then 29% transportation. So that just gives a big picture. And then very sadly, Australia's winning in ways that we really don't want to be. So we lead the world in mammal species extinction. There's an estimation that we've lost over 34 mammals in the last 200 years. And of course, 86% of Australian mammals are unique to our bioregion. They don't exist anywhere else in the world. We're fourth in the world in overall species extinction. So we're a bit of a case study in terms of what's happening in Australia. And we've had more than 20 major weather events since the beginning of 2024. So I think it's really clear that there's big things changing in our climate, and that's having devastating impacts on community. So I think one of the critical pieces in terms of this idea of climate justice is recognizing that the people who have contributed least to these major problems in terms of their resource use are the ones that are going to be impacted first. And that's at a global level, but we're also seeing that at a local level. And certainly this year, Henrietta Baird, who's the artist that Lena mentioned that I work with, her family are from Wujal in far north Queensland, and they've had 3 flood events in the last 12 weeks. So that's meant that the predominantly First Nations community has been displaced. And then just last week, we saw Borroloola being evacuated again from flooding. So it's causing these major disruptions, and it's something that we really need to take seriously. So to move into the arts, I think one of the things that I'm kind of interested in exploring is that over the last 50 years, which is relatively short time that professional arts has been developed in this country. And I know in other sessions you've talked about corporate governance structures and so on, but it's really only 50 years that those structures have been formalised, and Creative Australia is just about 50 years old in its former incarnation as the Australia Council for the Arts. Over that time, we've known about climate change, and for a whole lot of reasons have persistently done very little to mitigate the problem. And in our cultural systems, we've inherited the British systems that were imported and imposed. We've had a lot of influence through British and American cultural exports. And then 30 years of continuous economic growth up until sort of 2019 before COVID hit means that we've really been thinking in this way that Australia can just grow and grow and grow. And that is usually not considering the kind of resources that it needs to grow. So one of the questions I love to ask is, what resources are you dreaming with? Because this is one of the critical ways that we can start to think about how climate change and how we're thinking about our resources when we're dreaming. And another thing that I like to say is that the climate crisis is really a cultural crisis, and that's to do with the aspirations, attitudes, and behaviours that we are constantly influencing. And I'm really sorry to bring in the British into this conversation, but they've put it really perfectly. So this is a quote from the British Council, who says that the arts and cultural sector, through its different art forms, already engages the public and its communities, influences trends, drives interdisciplinary collaboration, sparks innovation, and entices action, all of which are essential to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So that's one of the ways in which I think the arts are really critical in this conversation about climate justice. Also, arts and cultural organisations are usually value-based, and that's another wonderful way in which we can start to think about how those values then can be utilised in terms of looking at a fairer world and bringing climate justice into that conversation. Now, lots of people say to me, oh, but actually the arts don't, we're not big industry. We don't use as much resource as a lot of the other industries around. And that's true. However, because we're the Imagineers of the culture, because we are often leaders when it comes to those attitudes and behaviours, it's really important that we take the biggest crisis that humanity has ever seen and start to engage with it. And there are many who have started to engage with it, but we need to ramp up and accelerate our action. And one of the sensitive areas is around travel. As I said before, at a global level, 29% of emissions comes from transport and travel, and 8% of the world's emissions out of that 29% comes from tourism. So that's significant, because a lot of our cultural activity is built into tourism agendas. So one of the other things that I'm curious to explore is rather than growing, how do we redistribute resources so there's greater diversity in the system? And this is largely about resources, but of course people are resources as well. And I have a very strong background in social justice, and I'm very passionate about equity, and how do we, in this moment where there's enormous interest in equity and inclusion, how do we make sure that that's redistributing rather than on this growth trajectory? And just to give you a few more stats around that, so basically the average household in Australia, which is 2.6 people, uses 15 to 20 tonnes of carbon. And the United Nations says that in order to keep the atmosphere from warming more than 1.5 degrees, we need to use 2 tonnes per person per year. So per household, that's 5.2 tonnes. So from 15 to 20 tonnes down to 5.2 tonnes. And I think that's very salutary, just in terms of how we think about the enormity of this problem. So in terms of governance, which I know is, really the primary reason why we've gathered here today, I think has been said in other sessions, First Nations governance and knowledge systems is absolutely part of the solution. And their principal core pillar of First Nations culture is care for country and the stewardship of the natural world, the rights of land and water. And some of you may have heard in New Zealand, the Wanganui River won a court case to be given the rights of a person, so that it could be fought for, the rights of that river could be fought for. And I think that that's incredible leadership in terms of how do we think about our relationship and our work and our responsibility towards the natural world. We're also, the arts offers incredible opportunity to be reimagining how we can do things more sustainably and be more regenerative. And Lena used that term at the top, and I just want to give a little bit of a definition for you. So regenerative practices, you may have heard it, it's sort of coming into common currency. It's most useful to think about in a farming context. And so rather than extractive practices, which is basically you try and get as much crop out of the ground as possible, if you're farming in a regenerative way, you're not tilling the soil so often, you're rotating crops, you're covering cropping, and you're using different kinds of composts and thinking about the health of the soil while you're using it to grow food or whatever you're growing. So, I mean, the key point for that is diversity, actually. And I think that's a wonderful, a wonderful element to be bringing into this conversation, because diversity in all things helps us to then have a richer relationship and think about the whole system. The other part of the arts that I think are really, really important in this space are that they're founded largely on low carbon skills. It's the way we use our bodies as performers. It's the ways of seeing for visual artists. It's the enlivening of senses. And in the world of creating product, we've often moved a bit away from those skills in terms of our relationship with the audience. So that feels a really rich place to start of how do we reinvest in those skills. Imagining how we live with care and responsibility to the natural world, and the management of resources are also, they're great imagination challenges. And of course, we are the sector that are the Imagineers. So that's a wonderful place. And then the other part that I'm super interested in, and governance really comes into this, is the machinery of the arts, how they're structured, how power works, how they're factored into the economy. And that has, for the last 50 years, largely been without considering the natural world. So there are all the opportunities. And I think that I'll leave it there. Thanks, Lena.
Thanks so much, Pippa, for that, for really setting the scene for us about how desperate the climate emergency is, and the possibilities for artists and the roles that the arts and creative sectors can play in imagining how things can look more sustainable and be more regenerative. And I really like that idea of what resources are you dreaming with. I'd now like to introduce our second presenter for today, Professor James Arvanitakis. James is the director of the Forest Research Foundation, which brings together the 5 Western Australian-based universities to attract world-class research to the state and confront the world's grand challenges. He's an award-winning educator, cultural researcher, and media commentator. James is a Fulbright alumnus, having spent 12 months at the University of Wyoming. In 2021, he was appointed the inaugural patron of Diversity Arts Australia, and he's also our former chair and someone who we collaborate with quite regularly. In 2021, he founded Respectful Disagreements, a Brave Spaces project that promotes the lost art of civility in political disagreement, as well as the educational power of discomfort. He sits on the Education Committee of the Governance Institute of Australia and is an adjunct professor at Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. James also has a much longer CV, very accomplished CV, but I will leave it there for now and hand over to James and for also setting the scene. So over to you, James. Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lena. And good morning, everyone. And hello from the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in beautiful Western Australia, Perth. It is fantastic to be speaking to you this morning about this incredibly important event. I'm honoured to be the patron of Diversity Arts Australia and want to acknowledge the incredible work undertaken by Lena and the team at Diversity Arts Australia, including Gorkum, who's worked so tirelessly to put these incredible panels together, as well as the ongoing commitment of the team at Creative Australia. And thank you to our Auslan interpreters, who just every time I work with you, I am always just blown away by your incredible work. Thank you, Pippa, for setting the scene. It's important that we never forget what we're dealing with, and also that we have these conversations while people are confronting some of the scariest things in the world, be it climate change, displacement, war, and sometimes war that's been brought on by resource restrictions or scarcity. So I want to discuss a few aspects of our role as arts organisations and the connection to climate justice. And I bring this from a position working for a leading science organisation, as a governance educator with the Governance Institute of Australia, and as a researcher focused on the empowerment of communities, as well as an arts-based researcher. And that means that I kind of work with scientists who work on the front line and artists who work on the front line of climate change. And they balance that sense of urgency with that sense of hope that we can adapt, adjust, and move forward. And I think it's important. I think that was one of the really great things when we had a conversation with Pippa earlier. That passion of reminding us an emergency, but then also embracing the ideas that she presented, I think is really important, that we never lose hope. Now, importantly, when this conversation probably started a few years ago, the position of arts-based organisations or boards was no different to that of boards more generally. As artists and art organisations, we often, and I apologise for using this term, scrounge around for money. And the thought is, how can we consider climate justice and other factors at the time when we're looking for money? But I want to make the point, and I suppose my central point today is a point that we should not think about this as a cost, but we should think about it as an opportunity. And I want to talk about an opportunity, not only for the organisations, but the legacy of those organisations. So let's think about it as an opportunity in three ways. The first is that we can set a clear pathway to assist us in our decision-making. Each organisation should have some sort of risk appetite profile, should have some sort of decision-making matrix, some sort of values-based matrix that outlines how we make our decisions and also what we stand for, ensuring that our influence is positive beyond just the arts-based practice, and to send a clear message to our supporters and our potential supporters of what we think, who we are, what we want to do, and how we believe in the sustainability of the planet, the communities around us, and the future generations. The second opportunity is that we clearly state our positions to our supporters, funders, potential supporters, and potential funders about what we stand for. So it's not only helps us create an environment where we make a decision internally inside the organisation, but actually clearly sends a message to those externally as well about who we are and what we stand for. And third, I believe it creates a foundation for making decisions going forward. And when we all will leave organisations that we currently work in, no matter how much we love and care for them, we need to let go at some point. But we can set a foundation of sustainability. And I think Pippa's point about sustainability is so important, because sustainability is not just about the planet, but it's about us as artists and as leaders. It's about the generations going forward. And my friend, a very, very dear friend, a very close friend who I've been honoured to work with, is from the Yaqui tribe, the Yaqui Nation, in the southern part of Arizona and the northern part of Mexico. And, he tells me that his philosophy of his elders, that every decision we make today should consider at least 4 generations ahead, how it will impact them ahead. And so if we think about it, we want our organizations to be sustainable, and we can only be sustainable in a sustainable planet. But how? How do we address this? How do we overcome that sense of, I suppose, despondency or being overwhelmed with these decisions? And, and for scientists, sometimes it's they go, okay, I'm going to respond by my research. I'm going to respond by finding, a better way to move carbon around the world to basically have no carbon impact. And that is one thing that obviously, but arts organizations also need to think about how we're going to respond or how we should be responding. Addressing climate change and climate justice requires a proactive and strategic action for all sections of society, including corporate governance and the governance of arts organization. As directors or as arts leaders, we are the stewards of our organizations and the impact that those organizations have on the environment. So here are 5 things I think we can do. The first thing I think is to establish climate justice as a board or an organizational priority. Now, this does not mean that you remove the arts basis or the arts priority of what you want to do, but it simply means that we as an arts-based organizations will not only produce what we need to do or what we want to do or what we stand for, but we'll do that in a way that actually acknowledges climate-related issues and build that into our strategic priorities. The second is to understand our circles of influence. That is, who can we impact and how can we impact them? Who should we have a conversation with and what do we ask from them? And this can be influential about our suppliers, who we employ, how we work, but also making decisions around travel. Now, this is a really important one that I think Pippa raised. And I think, the opportunity of holding a discussion like this online is a fantastic opportunity for us to sit there and think, well, what would have been our carbon footprint if we all decided to fly to Sydney or Melbourne to have this conversation? I think we can use various tools and think about our circles of influence and how we impact that. The third is to actually set climate goals. So I talked about it as a strategic priority, but to sit there and think about, okay, what would we look like if we reduced our carbon footprint by a certain percentage? Now, I think, the point that people made about going from, say, 20 tons to 2 tons, for most of us, that's an overwhelming. So why don't we sit there and think about, well, why don't we go from, 20 tons to 18 tons and then achieve that and then think, okay, we've done that. How do we go to 15 tons or 12 tons or 8 tons and so on? This momentum, this is a process that we need to go through, and it can allow us to take people with us. And I've got one of our researchers here has looked at all these incredible environmental action plans and why they fail. And the main reason that they fail is that they fail to take people with them as they work through. So as organizations, we need to take people with us, which takes me to my 4th point, which is about engaging with and finding appropriate stakeholders and working with them to achieve what we want to achieve. And that's a conversation that needs to be had. Not all stakeholders will have the priorities that we have, but it's important that we have those conversations. So if you have a key stakeholder that has a different set of priorities or doesn't have this as a priority, that's the conversation that I think is really worth having. And if they don't budge, then the question you need to ask as leaders, or be it on the board level or artists, is to think about, well, how is there another stakeholder I want to work with that closer reflects my values? Or what do I do to take this stakeholder with me? And the final point, and I think this again picks up on one of Pippa's important points, is to integrate climate change into our programming or climate conversations into our programming. I've just started working with an organization called Entertainment for Change. Entertainment for Change uses documentaries and fictionalized movies to have conversations. Now, the really important thing about this is that there are some times where a real front-on conversation, a real big thud, a real big shock, and the kind of figures that people noticed is really valuable to kind of shock people into thinking about something. But at the same, sometimes it's more subtle conversations that we need to have. And I think one of the things that we as arts leaders need to think about is when we're engaging with someone, what point along the spectrum are they at? If they're not ready to have that deeper or that more full-on conversation, do we lose them in that process? And how do we go through in making sure that we take, again, going back to that point about taking people with us? Now, this, in fact, is one of my research areas. And I think that the point that Pippa said about Imagineers is so powerful. My research has often looked at the way that arts can act both as a mirror onto society, but also the way that arts, and I'm talking about the arts in the broader sense of the word, can also help us cross a threshold and see the world differently and see the potential of the world, that imagination, the Imagineers that Pippa drew on. And there's an incredible concept by a famous philosopher called Heidegger. And Heidegger talked about this idea of threshold moments and the role of the arts in encouraging the world to cross threshold moments. Now, Heidegger was writing in the 30s, the 20s and 30s, and he was talking about the poets and the musicians. But it could be the street artists, or it could be the performances or the movies that we make. How do we get people to cross that threshold moment? And I think that's really important. And if we have a chance to unpack that, I would love to. Now, I want to end by making a couple of points. The first is going back to this idea that when Lena introduced me, talking about respectful disagreement. And that is that over the years, I've come to embrace the concept of what has been labeled as pragmatic idealism. There are times we need to ensure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good, finding ways to achieve something small that can help us create momentum. But creating momentum is not enough. We need to continue that. So going back to the idea of the impact, we can reduce our climate footprint by 10%, and not just rest on that and say, okay, we've done the 10%, let's all pat ourselves on the back. This should be seen as only ever a good start. And so pragmatic idealism is a really interesting way to think about dealing with those stakeholders who are along that spectrum. Some who want to jump in and go all in, and those who are fearful and not ready to have those more complex conversations. The second comes from a friend of mine, and he's a guy called Dan Gregory. He's a former comedian and now works as a sort of a consultant with organizations. And he's done a lot of work with scientific organizations. And one of the things he said to an audience of climate activists or climate scientists once was, you would rather be, the problem with scientists often is that you would rather be right than rich. And you've got to figure out that you can be both. Now, what does this mean, right? What it means is that, and this is my position, and you don't always have to take, and I'm not saying that this is right for everyone, but Dan said, there are examples, many examples of scientists turning back their opportunity to work with organizations that they can have an impact in because they've been uncomfortable with that, where that organization currently stands. And he said, what we need to do is think about where that organization can end up. Now, this is not greenwashing. This is about thinking, are they willing to go? And that goes back to that spectrum of attitudes and behavior. What's important is that each of our organizations needs to find a position that we are comfortable with in pursuing. And we as individual decision makers, artists and board members need to also be comfortable with that position. But key is that we work together to support each other with those conditions, those organizations. There are times when boycotts are the right way. There are times to take the hands of organizations or walk with them slowly. And there are times when we need to be more aggressive. Each one is a different decision that needs to be made depending on the context we are in. And I think that's one of the difficult conversations that we need to have. But if I go back to my first point, that is exactly the role of boards, of leaders within organizations, is to have those difficult conversations and take people with us. So I think I'm at 14 and a half minutes. So Lena, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. That was thank you for that really thoughtful sharing of ideas about how at the governance level institutions and organisations need to think about their responsibility to the climate crisis and to consider what their sphere of influence is. And thanks so much for the very practical and actionable steps that you gave lots of examples of how we can get there. And I love that, you know, how do we get people to cross the threshold kind of idea. That's a really important idea. And it's always good to bring Heidegger into our conversations in general. I'm joking. So now I'm going to ask you, Pippa, if you'd like to turn on your camera, and James as well. I'm going to ask you some questions about how within our current, so the theme is around how within our current arts governance structures, we can address climate justice, a lot of which you've already spoken about. So I want to unpack some of those ideas that you've already shared with us a little bit more. And I might start with you, Pippa, by asking whether the arts and creative sectors can afford to ignore the climate crisis, and how can we actually reconcile the, you know, financial realities of many of our organisations with the environmental urgency as well. And often we know that there are these economic interests that are pitted against environmental concerns in the arts and creative sectors. It's like, I can't, like James touched on that as well. You know, I can't afford to do this, and this is not, you know, this is what we're doing, and this is too big as an organisation. So, so over to you, Pippa.
Thank you. It's all the small questions today. Also, thank you so much, James. I also really love those practical points. I am a producer by trade. I love action. And I would add to your piece around crossing the threshold that actually the arts have the opportunity to rehearse the future. And that's one of the things that I really like to push, that in a play space, if we can kind of give ourselves permission to be in a space where we're able to dream up some of the solutions that seem impossible and then have a go, that's exactly what we need now. Because we're at this point in the crisis where we're in this territory where no one really knows how the planet's going to react. We're also in great need of people who can hold experimental processes. And again, the arts are great places with people with skills for that. Can we afford to ignore the climate crisis? No, we cannot, not in any way. And I think that's partly why earlier I was suggesting that, you know, we've already done that for quite a long time. And that's partly why we're in the extreme position that we're in right now. And so I want to kind of think a little bit about what those solutions might look like, particularly at a governance level, when I know, and I've sat in many board meetings where really the bottom line is the bottom line. I just want to also throw up for people that there's a lot of exploration of alternative economic models. And I think that's interesting just for you to know, because one of the challenges, and James kind of alluded to this too, one of the challenges is that actually in some ways the current economic models don't work for the arts. They also don't work for health, they don't work for education, they don't work, you know, they don't work for the social services. Things that are intensely labor focused, human to human, haven't worked so well in the idea of an extractive economy, which is pulling things out of the ground and shipping, you know, selling them off to the highest bidder. So some of those alternatives are around donut economics, which really is trying to consider planetary boundaries in the way that you think about your resource use, modern monetary theory, and circular economy. And I just want to throw those out there just because this is an introduction, I imagine, for some people watching, and some things to go and have a look at. In terms of our own organisations, I would say that first of all, the mental health impact of ignoring this issue is enormous. And I'm not sure if any studies have been particularly done on this, but I think, you know, you really, sorry, I'm stumbling because it's one of those things where I go, I can't believe that people still aren't engaging. That's partly me racing ahead and not always taking people on the journey, James. So I respect that note. But I think one of the things is that, but because there are so many big disasters going on and people finding it too overwhelming, then that can in itself cause a mental health crisis. So actually, in terms of some of those practical solutions that James was offering, just starting the journey is a really important thing to do at whatever level that you're at. And it can save you money. So we've already found that, you know, there's lots of people switching their power to renewables. That's saving money. There's ways of reducing resource use through recycling and some of those things. They will get you to a certain point in terms of your journey, but they're a fabulous place to start and really important. And that's a great way of feeling empowered and engaged and noticing. And then join with others to find solutions. That's another piece that I think is really important. We're great at collaboration in the arts. Often we've got a lot of skills in that area and collaboration is really needed. And then the last piece, we get tipped into thinking about the systems, and I'll talk about that a little bit more a bit later. But
thanks for that, Pippa. So because Pippa's touched on just both James, you've given us some really practical strategies, and so have you, Pippa. You've added some to those, and you've both talked about the importance of the role of the board. So what, James, is the role of the board in terms of their responsibility to climate justice and environmental sustainability? What's their role? What kind of leadership do we want to see from our arts and creative sector boards?
Yeah, look, I mean, the role of a board is, you know, and look, I will say, like, I mentioned that I was a governance educator, and it's the most boring thing. If you want to lose friends or lose conversation to people at parties, you should say that sometimes. Yeah, I'm on an education advisory group for the Governance Institute of Australia. It's not a very sexy topic. But the reason I got into governance, actually, Lena, and you know, and I think it's a really important one for us to reflect on, is because I've seen so many good organizations go down the toilet, right? Because of bad governance structures, because good people with the right intentions couldn't find a way forward, and it became a thoughtful process. It became a process of who's got the loudest voice and who can get the most people on the board to agree with me and stuff like that. So ultimately the role of a board is to ensure that the government, and you know, there's the legal obligations, but forget all that. I mean, that goes without saying. The role of a board is to promote the sustainability of an organization, that the organization runs well and runs for, as I said, generations to come. Now, we cannot think about sustainability in isolation as financial sustainability. We need to think about sustainability and sustainability of the people around us. You know, as a board member, one of the first things and you can contradict me about this if you want, Lena. I hope you don't. But you know, one of my priorities was your well-being, right? As a CEO of the organisation, the staff's well-being, and so the well-being and the sustainability of the organisation. What we ask from the artists that we work with, the people that we work with, we don't take care of them. But then, you know, again, the role of the board in this area is to really set the agenda and empower the people within the organisation, be it the CEO and the staff, to achieve what needs to be achieved. I think the board shouldn't be interventionists. I don't believe in interventionist boards. But the role of the board here is so important to set that agenda around climate justice. Because I think there are very, very, you know, and then figuring out what helping, assisting, and that's a word important, not necessarily directing, but assisting the organisation to get there, right? That's the role. And so where I see this being really valuable is, I go back to this idea of circles of influence. You know, if every organisation, as you're doing your strategic planning, not only thought about what we want to look like in a year's time or 5 years' time, but drew a circle, a small circle, and then a larger circle, and then a large circle, and say we have multiple spheres of influence, right? And then you go, okay, how do we influence with those goals of not only being a great arts or based organization, but achieving that climate justice, thinking about the future generations? Well, there are some people that are very close to getting influence, obviously the people that we work with directly. And then there are the people that, the next one might be the people, our audience or our supporters, and then the bigger one and our funders, and the bigger one could be, working with organizations like Creative Australia and Create New South Wales, others to have that bigger influence. So the board is fundamental in achieving those. Without that direction, without strategic priorities set by the board, an organisation cannot have any real impact on achieving those goals.
Thanks, thanks, James. No.
Sound exciting? Have I made governance sound exciting?
It does. It sounds really exciting. I definitely talked to you at a party about governance. And I want to ask you a follow-on question, but I want to ask it to you and Pippa, which is because we're talking about, the role of governance structures, the role of the board in all of this, but are our governance structures actually capable of supporting this kind of change or these kinds of shifts in the way that in terms of environmental considerations? Are they fit for purpose? And I might ask Pippa first and then come back to you, James.
Thanks, Lena. I have two answers to that. One is that we need to work with what we've got to a certain extent. So absolutely they are, because that's what we've got. Is there room to be transitioning them as we think about transitioning our economy and our society? Absolutely. And I know that in a previous session from this series, you've addressed some of those issues of, how you think about governance. I also go back to something I said in my presentation, which is we inherited governance structures that were imported and imposed predominantly from Britain. They're very hierarchical, and the arts, because of the role that culture plays in British and European culture, and that's where those structures have come from, we've inherited a whole lot of things that have never really grown here or been unpacked here. So for me, that's why looking to First Nations governance and leadership in that space is so important, because it's rooted in this country, on this land, and care for country is a founding principle. So I think there are indications of where that governance can go, but I certainly don't want to sit in a session about governance and diss the people who have turned up wanting help. I think it's really important that, yes, of course, you can do more in your place where you are right now, and that's an important part of it. Thanks.
Pio, I'll jump in. I think you're spot on there. These are the structures that we have to work with, and these are the legal structures, and so we need to operate within them. I will say that 20, 30 years ago, the only responsibility the board had was a fiduciary responsibility to be financially sound. I think we've seen attempts, and they're not, we can criticize them and we can talk about them in different ways, about triple bottom line, other forms of reporting and so on. And look, and they've been effective in different ways, and depending on the leadership within the organization, they've either been really effective or they've been a form of greenwashing, and I think we need to acknowledge that. So look, I think there's so much more that can be done. The structures that we have, but do give us a certain level of flexibility that I think is really, really important. And I think that is, right back to that first point about how do we balance these fiduciary responsibility we have in sustaining the organisation, but also that sort of is that other sustainability, the other levels of the other very, very important points of sustainability. And so I think, when we think about that, in those structures, as board members, as chairs, or as board members, we can use those positions to help influence the organisation and help shape the organisation, and that's the balance that we need to find. Look, it's a board, for a really simple thing, like you're going back to sustainability, a board has the ability to make sure that its staff are taken care of. A board has the ability to make sure that its staff feel empowered. A board has the ability to ensure that the staff feel that they're having a positive impact. I mean, I think most of the people that get involved in the art sector and the art sectors, as you know, as they do in the sciences, we're very purpose driven. We want purpose, and I think when people have purpose, then you know, we thrive, right? We thrive as human beings, and I think creating that purpose of producing great art, but also thinking about the future generations, gives us a purpose that is incredible, and I think we'll have thriving organisations as a result. And I want to pick up on a really important point that Pippa said, and it reflected in all the research I've done. When you empower people, they're healthier, right? They are healthier. If you work for an organisation where people feel totally disempowered, if people feel that you're basically, you know, you're treating them as if they're peons and they have no thoughts and you're just telling them what to do, if you're working with an organisation that people feel is destructive, you're not getting the best out of the people, either efficiently, either when it comes to pure economic measures, or when it comes to them emotionally. And I think, you know, there's been lots of research to confirm that organisations that empower people to be driven by that sense of purpose, you have a much, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to well-being, when it comes to the functioning of that organisation, is incredible. It just has incredible benefits. So again, you know, when we think about the structures that we're in, sure, we're limited by certain legal obligations. It may not be the best structures. If we could, you know, if we could use Pippa's word about reimagining, practicing the future, but it's what we've got, and we can really embrace that position to do really special things.
Thanks so much, James. I like that you're both coming from strengths-based positions as well. So I think that's really important. And James, you talked a lot about what boards can affect, what they can impact, how they can empower people and organisations. So that's a nice segue into a question for Pippa about the role of power in all of this. And Pippa, in your opinion, how can power dynamics impact efforts to address the climate crisis within creative sector organisations and institutions?
Thanks, Lena. I think for me, and I've been in some situations with watching boards not necessarily be aware enough about their power in the situation. And I guess for me, that's why I talk a lot about hierarchical systems. And I think it's really important as we're looking at change, and the change is going to happen whether we're directing it or not. That's what climate change is kind of meaning. So really the urge and urgency to kind of get on board is to have a sense of agency in this space. And in doing so, and I'll follow on from James's piece about the spheres of influence, because part of that spheres of influence, the way we've been trained to think of that, is to constantly look up and constantly look to people with more power and more privilege, and kind of not notice who's left out of that space. So part of it is, how do we get greater self-awareness about how our power structures work, and what can we do to be noticing who's left out at a local level, perhaps at a national level, and then at an international level, because in some ways where, you know, most arts organisations have some hope that their work will be translating into other contexts. And again, we do a lot of touring into big international, you know, into people with the money to afford Australian work, and we don't necessarily notice those who are drowning in the Pacific, for example. So there's something in that I think is what arts governance needs to start to get better at. And, you know, these are muscles that just need building. So wherever you are on that journey, it's that piece of kind of stepping in and going, how do we notice how we build social and cultural capital? What's the shorthand on that? How do we perhaps just be able to interrupt those processes a little bit so that we've got equity and fairness and justice in the frame? I think the other piece about power for me is that, and this is a weird one, but it goes back to the rights of nature, that actually there's an awful, and our terrible track record on species extinction, there's an awful lot of disempowered in that story. So again, another piece of responsibility and stewardship and being self-aware with the power piece is to be able to go, in my place where my organization is based, what are the things that are endangered? What are the things that I can look after? And that doesn't have to be the whole world, because I can totally respect that it gets really overwhelming quickly. So being local is a really great way of being able to kind of create some boundaries that feel manageable, and then be able to dive in there and go, okay, how are we using our resources? How are we managing them? How are we utilizing that power piece? The other part of the idea of spheres of influence is it makes us think about the whole system. And one of the challenges in the climate piece has been we've sort of forgotten that we're really reliant on the natural world around us. So to be able to look through our systems and think a bit more systemically, and other sectors are a little bit further advanced in my experience than the arts sector. So I'm really, really keen that we start to think about ourselves in a system and start to get across how we maneuver towards this climate justice piece.
Thanks, Pippa. So James and Pippa, we have about 15 minutes left of the conversation, and I'm going to move to the second topic, which is how do we move to something different to really address the crisis? So James, how do we move away from seeing this work as a burden, and instead see it as an opportunity? And you did touch on this, you both touched on this, but I think it is a mindset shift as well. As Pippa mentioned, sometimes we're in the creative sector, we're not doing this as well as in other sectors and spaces.
You're on mute, James.
Sorry. If I'm gonna drop the veil of secrecy, is I'm actually in the process of moving house. So the only thing that's here is basically the chair that I'm sitting on, the table that this computer is sitting on, and the two paintings behind, well, two artworks behind me. So that was the removalists knocking on the door. So it's a bit of a sensitive time at the moment in the household. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm totally distracted. Can we ask me that question again?
Oh, sure. No, and I just yeah. So thank you for it's amazing. You're doing this while you're getting, you're moving houses. That's commitment.
And people are moving things in front of me.
That's commitment to the cause. So how do we move away from seeing this as a burden and instead see it as an opportunity, particularly in a context where, Pippa said sometimes within our sector, we need to look outside into other spaces to see how they're doing it, because we're not always addressing environmental justice concerns at all or well.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things to say about that. And I think we talked about mindset shift, but it's also a cultural shift, and cultural change can take a bit of time. And that's part of, I suppose, what I was emphasizing on, is to think about, well, how do we take people with us in this way? I think, the way that we really do need to do it, as I said, is to just, and it sounds so banal, is to begin a conversation. Is to begin at a board level, just to have that conversation, right? Because I think on the surface of it, when someone, and it goes back to that sort of that point of disempowerment. On the surface of it, all we do is go, we're a small arts organization, we have this tiny budget. What can we do, right? Oh, we can't do anything. But that is apart from being defeatist, is so wrong. Because if you sit down as a board and you go as a board of staff and have a conversation, it's okay, we need to be sustainable. We want to be economically sustainable. We want to meet all our fiduciary responsibilities. We want to achieve all the things that we want to achieve. But how do we do that within the context of a climate crisis or a climate emergency, or the need to achieve climate justice? What does that look like? And if you just begin with that conversation, you will be surprised about where that conversation can take you. And I think, you know, it could be everything, as I said, from thinking about the organization, programming, and not that I'm saying that boards should necessarily get involved in programming directly, but so yeah, warning on that one. But what I am saying is it's a discussion in the sense of, well, how do we share this message, and also thinking about, you know, the resources we're using and how we use them, to the conversations with staff about what is possible. You know, I mean, if, you know, as weird as it sounds, you know, like one of the things that we learned during the pandemic was that, you know, we don't always have to drive to work, right? And for many people, not all people, but for many people, working from home was a good process for sustainability, both in the cost, but also in the in you know, for their well-being. They had a chance to, you know, just work in their pajamas, which could be really healthy for some people. The problem was when you have to do it every day for 3 months. That's the problem, I think, that people found challenging. But again, what I'm saying is, when you begin the conversation, you think about what can we do. When you start thinking about your spheres of influence, then I think that's really important. And that's how cultural shift happens. Culture shift happens slowly. It happens through conversations. It happens through a bit of, you know, it happens through leadership. It happens through a number of ways. And I think the role of the board is fundamental in achieving that. Like, you cannot, you know, without the board supporting this prioritization, without the board being behind this conversation, it's going to be very hard for it to achieve what we want it to achieve.
Thanks, James. So everyone, please put that on your agenda for your board meeting at least once a year to have this conversation and check your policies and your procedures and ways of working. I think that they're really practical and achievable ways, just starting with the conversation as well as implementing, you know, things that you can, what you can implement. So Pippa, I am really interested in some examples of how we could do this, and what you know, organizations who are doing this or doing it well, and what new structures would look like if that would truly enable us to address climate justice in the creative sector. So I'm going to throw to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something to James's list, because I think we need more artists on boards. I think it's really, really important that we have creative people in those spaces, and champions of climate at every level of organisation, so that they can come together, and that also starts to disrupt some of the hierarchical challenges. That the idea of collaborating, not competing, which I think certainly happens artist to artists a lot. There's a very collegiate part of our culture, but sometimes if your primary function is to look after the health of the organisation, which is what, you know, James, I agree with you, that is what a board is there to do, but somehow that can become a very competitive space. So how do you shift away from that? And I think I said before, be local and go back to the creative skills. One of the things that I really feel like we need as a culture at every level is much bigger ideas. So one of my challenges to boards is, how do you move faster than the speed of your comfort with this new issue? And, you know, there's plenty of experts out there, James and me and lots of other people who have got a lot of practice in this space. And I think it is one time where it's useful to have have help, so that you can move fast, because I agree with you, James, generally culture moves slowly, but we actually need to move quickly. And COVID has shown us that when we have crisis, we can move quickly. So how do we just challenge ourselves to be a little bit beyond our comfort zone in terms of the speed that we're moving? I'd love to talk about, in terms of alternatives, I'm doing some work with Jacob Boehm, which you mentioned at the beginning, Lena. He's a First Nations Narungagana man based on Kulin Nation in Melbourne. So he's from South Australia, but based in Melbourne. And he is setting up a company based on First Nations protocols. Now, this is a really interesting experiment. We're in a new phase. We're working with his elders, and really trying to, we've mapped the protocols, and there's lots of nuance, but in principle, it's care for country, care for kin, and kin is all living things. Respect for elders, responsibility for future generations, and James, you've already mentioned that. And then the restoration of songlines, and that be a possible way that we start think about how we tour and travel across this country, that we re-establish some of those ancient ways. And he had a project called Wild Dog, which came about in 2022, which was looking at the songline of the dingo, which of course is a endangered and persecuted mammal in this country. And the songline of the dingo can also be found in the south of India, in Thailand, in Taiwan. So it's really interesting to start to go back into some of that ancient knowledge, and really it gives lots of possibility of different ways of doing things. And having elders in the space is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, because it slows us down. And it also makes sure that there is history present in the room, which often we as a nation and as a culture, we're really, really in love with the next thing, and sometimes forget that there's past knowledges that we can also be learning from. So that's one piece of work that I think, it's watch this space a little bit. It's called Idja Arts, and I'm really hoping that will initiate some more conversations. Another example is the wonderful Antonia Seymour at Arts on Tour. She is absolutely determined to green and revolutionize touring in this country, and is doing some incredible work, coming up with examples. There's a report that I helped her with, which has a whole lot of examples of artists playing in lots and lots of different ways. The other First Nations artist that I'm working with, Henrietta Baird, she has a project she's been working on for a few years called Plant a Promise, which was inspired by the 2019-2020 bushfires. And she's a plant specialist as well as a choreographer and dancer, and the work is inspiring and encouraging people to plant a promise to take care of country. And we're planning a saltwater tour, so that is from where she lives in Sydney up to Wujal and Cairns, as the big centre near there in far north Queensland. We want to travel by train, tour by train, and the permission, we go first to elders in community and ask whether they want the work to come to them, and then we go to the local arts centre if they say yes. So there's a few different ideas of just, the glimmers of new ways forward. And I just go back to the point I made before. Big ideas is really what we need, even if they seem ridiculous and impossible. We kind of need to be bringing them into our conversation to start shifting our thinking.
Thanks, Pippa. And as you said, artists are the ones who are, the ones to bring in with the big ideas, and that, they're needed across not just the creative sector, but we need artists and creatives and creative thinkers to think about these issues in general across all areas and industries. James, you touched on in your introduction the importance of partnerships and stakeholders and having conversations. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about the possibilities for working with partners and stakeholders. In your mind, what can that bring? What can, I guess, healthy partnerships and relationships bring to this work and conversation?
Yeah, look, I mean, we can't achieve any of this on our own. You can be the most sustainable and socially just organization in the world, but unless we work with partners, and I think we can think of partners and stakeholders, I suppose, in three ways for us to think about how we work together. The first, I think, is those who we have, and again, this is probably partially linked to the idea of circles of influence, but the first is, I think, those who we directly work with, and making sure that our values align. It's fundamental, and not some organizations will probably be way ahead of where we're at, and others will be, and we can seek to learn from them, and other organizations will be not anywhere near where we're at, and we can seek to shape them. And that's really, really important. The second is the partnerships with organizations who that are also on the same path as us, but we don't necessarily always agree with. And a few years ago, you know, I used to run a human rights organization, and it was always seen as being on the more sort of activist / radical edge of the political spectrum. And I remember once we were working, there was another organization which is probably a lot more on the moderate end, and we'd have these conversations where they would say to us, you know, what you do is brilliant for us, because you create an environment where we can go in and say, hey, you can either deal with the guys outside trying to blockade your conference, or you can deal with us, right? Now, I had no problem with that. I had no problem with them kind of painting us as the scary, crazy leftists, right? Right? Because for me, that was for me, what was important was the outcome, right? I have no problem with yeah, and that's what I think is really important, those conversations to be had, because again, the people that we work with will be along a different spectrum, along different spectrums of where there are. What I didn't like was when my fellow activists who I was working with would sit there and say, "Oh, they're sellouts." They, I think that's that self-policing and that putting down people with the same end goals is just undermining, and it's just a waste of energy, And so the people I work with always said to them, look, it's a different path. We can create opportunities. And I think the third idea of partnerships.
And James, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we need to wrap up in a few
Yeah,
minutes.
I'll leave it at that. I suppose there were two ones, and I was probably going to say something banal, the third one anyway. But
I doubt that, but I think this has been such an amazing conversation, and I think there's so much more to talk about and so much more to unpack. And you've both given us so many practical kind of ideas and so many so practical kind of strategies, actionable strategies that we can use, and so many good ideas that we can reflect upon and take back to our own work and our own organizations. So thank you so much for generously giving your time and your ideas to everyone who's joining this webinar. I also wanted to remind people that we'll be sharing, so look in, I guess, in the comments section. We'll be also including some resources, some of the resources that Pippa has mentioned. So we'll be sharing those with you so that you have some kind of very solid and concrete things to take away, so that you don't feel totally that where do I start, so that you've got a place to start. I also wanted to end this by really thanking Gurkam Ajaralu, the series producer. Gurkam has done a brilliant job of pulling all of this together, and is a very skilled producer, a theatre producer, and in many other areas. And so thank you sincerely for all of your work, and also to thank the other team members at Diversity Arts Australia who've worked on this, including Aisha Mahmood. And I'd also like to thank Creative Australia, particularly Adelaide, Emerald and Adam, for all of your incredible work and vision for this talk series. Thank you so much. And of course, a massive thank you to James and Pippa for making this session so good, and also for being so adaptable. A very good skill to have in the art sector when we needed to pre-record this instead of do it live at the last minute. So thank you so much. Over I don't know if I need to throw it over to Creative Australia or if we just close it there.
Thanks, Lena. I can take it from here. And thank you, Lena, for being such an incredible host of these conversations. It's a hard role sometimes to hold space for all of these complex ideas and manage some really passionate panelists. And it's been really wonderful to work alongside you. So thank you. That's all we've got time for today, folks. So please check out the Creative Australia website for the other videos in the Governance Conversation series, and also keep an eye on the Creative Australia website for further announcements, the Creative Australia newsletter for further announcements about other governance resources that will be available. I'll close it there. Thank you.